In early January 2021, all eyes were on the US Capitol. Few people were paying attention to this guy. 9 days before Trump left office, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo named Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism.
Universally seen as a purely political move in order to leave a problem behind for the Biden people.
Being designated a state sponsor of terrorists is one of the most serious and harmful classifications that exist.
There's one big problem with naming Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism.
There's no evidence that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism.
That designation is it's an ugly symbol.
For Cubans, the designation is more than symbolic, it's hypocritical.
Cuba no es patrocinadora de ningún terrorismo en ninguna parte.
Nosotros no somos terroristas, al contrario. Hemos recibido los ataques terroristas, sobre todo de Estados Unidos.
Las bombas que han puesto, los atentados que han hecho aquí en Cuba, fuera de Cuba, en sede diplomática, han sido ellos los que lo han patrocinado.
In 1976, former CIA operatives Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch masterminded a bomb attack on a Cuban civilian airliner. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere until 9/11. All 73 people on board were killed. Both men later lived freely in Miami and were never prosecuted for their crime by US authorities. For decades, paramilitary groups planned and carried out terrorist attacks against Cuba from US soil. An Italian tourist was killed from one of 11 bombs placed at hotels in Havana in 1997. The bomber testified that Posada Carriles paid him to do it. In recent years, Cuban-American extremists in Florida have openly promoted armed attacks in Cuba on social media.
Tenemos que pagarle a cuanto la gente quiera cobrar por darle candela a todas las patrullas, a todo lo que tenga que ver con el Estado. Le pagamos para que millones sean libres, tiene que morir 1 millón.
El camino es uno solo, guerra abierta, clandestina en Cuba.
Trump seemed unconcerned by armed groups in South Florida threatening violence. Instead, his administration came up with 3 reasons to justify calling Cuba a sponsor of terrorism. The first stemmed from Cuba's role as a mediator between Colombia's government and rebels considered terrorists by the US. For decades, Cuba has received praise internationally and in Colombia itself for being a state sponsor of peace, not terrorism. As Colombia resumes peace talks with the rebels, its president has urged Biden to take Cuba off the terrorism list.
Lo que estamos presenciando es una enorme injusticia internacional.
Trump's second reason for putting Cuba on the list was for harboring fugitives of US justice, like Assata Shakur.
It has harbored cop killers, hijackers, and terrorists.
I escaped, A, because I was afraid for my life, and B, because I knew that I would never receive justice.
Assata Shakur and other fugitives cited by the US were never convicted of committing acts of terrorism. And Cuba hasn't received a single US political exile in over 30 years. Finally, the Trump administration claimed that Cuba's support for Nicolás Maduro somehow encouraged terrorist activity in Venezuela. If this sounds far-fetched, it's because it is. No evidence was ever presented to back up the claim.
Le interesa sobre todo tener un pretexto más para continuar con el embargo.
Quiere perjudicarnos. Ese es el fin.
The state sponsor of terrorism designation is designed to devastate Cuba's economy.
It vindicates the decision of these banks to have pulled back and not have any contact with Cuba.
They won't touch it because Cuba's on the terrorist list. But they say, well, we just have a policy. We won't deal with any transaction involving a country on the list. The word terrorism is a powerfully emotive word. It's just extremely difficult to get out from under that.
In March 2021, Biden officials said they were open to reconsidering the designation.
And we're committed to carefully reviewing policy decisions made in the prior administration, including the decision to designate Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Then again, 16 months later,
we are always examining the facts and applying them against the law.
And then again, last month,
we have clear laws, clear criteria, clear requirements, and we will continue as necessary to revisit those.
But so far, the Biden administration has kept Cuba on the list.
It would be very easy and relatively low cost to take Cuba off that list. It would take away an insult.
It's a process that's not very difficult. It's not rocket science, actually. If they have political will, they can very easily undo the damage that Trump had done with this list.